Here is Taccia Sharuku Koiame, an orange ink. And I'm sure I butchered that name.
Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
Here is a beautiful kind of sunset orange that needs more attention in the fountain pen community. It is fairly consistent across papers with only minor tone changes, and it shades very consistently to a red from, or like a very beautiful sunset. Very nice. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it performs well enough, but you do lose some of the shading, which is a real shame. But otherwise, it stays well behaved. If I didn't have 2 bottles of Sailor Apricot that I use as my really go-to orange, I would jump on a bottle of this. So if you need an orange in your collection, I highly recommend this one.
The pen for today is a Pilot E95S with a medium nib. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Take a look at that beautiful sunset orange tone that we're getting on the page. It has no feather and it has no spread. It shades in every single word. All of them. Always shading from orange to red, back to orange, back to... It's so beautiful to look at. It really is. This is a sunset in Florida. It's so nice. I can't say enough for it other than to just say, look at this. Looking at the back of the page between the wiggling fingers, we see that we have no performance issues as it has no bleeding and no ghosting.
Let's take a look at some other inks from the same manufacturer. Here is Taccia Classic Blue Jeans number 5. Here is Taccia Murasaki. Here is Taccia Hokusai Fukaki Hanada. Here is Taccia Yukiori Shikaru Karacha. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook.
The tone we get here on the page is very much the same that we had on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade, but not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. Take a look at "but" on the first line, where it gives very nice shading. The B is a nice mid-tone, the U lightens up a little bit, the T gets very dark. But below, to the left of that, doesn't show any of the really darker areas, only the mid-tones and lighter tones. And we get a lot of that mid and lighter tone on this paper.
Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting. We have great performance from this ink. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook. The tone we get on the page here is very much the majority tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. However, it is much more just that lighter tone. Now, it's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's barely shading. There are a couple spots, like the R of hour on the first line, or the E of 1 on the second line. But for the most part, we're staying solid at a midtone. Really makes me feel like this ink's tone was affected by the tone of the paper, eating up a bunch of that shading to midtones. Looking at the back of the page, no problems as we have no bleeding and no ghosting. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook. This is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade like it does on the Clairfontaine. Take a look at like on the third line where you see it starts nice and light with the LI and the KE do darken up a little bit. It shades like it, but not as frequently. So many are going to say these are the same papers and they're owned by the same company, but the paper is not the same, or suffer the wrath of wrath on the second line, where it really only shows some of the lighter tones through most of the word, midtones at the bottom of the T into the H. It's not shading as frequently as it did on the Clairfontaine, but it's shading in the same way. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, all smiles as we can continue writing back here.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Diamine Citrus Ice.
Here is Graf von Faber-Castell Burnt Orange. Here is Mont Blanc Gandhi. Here is Monteverde Mandarin Orange.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
This is a slightly lighter, slightly more muted, slightly flatter tone than it was on the Clairfontaine. Not to be surprised when you're using this paper. It has a tendency to do that, but it does not feather and it does not spread, which it does not have a tendency to do. It does show some shading on par with what we saw with the Rhodia, meaning it's shading as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, nowhere near as frequently. Look at his path like straws on the first line. The top of the H is a bit lighter than the hump of the H into the is at the end. Now, path starts with a nice midtone, goes lighter on the A, midtone on the T, bit darker on the H, like nice light tone on the LI, straight to a darker tone with the KE at the end. Looking at the back of the page, no bleed, no ghost, happy lab notes. That's what we have here. Happy lab notes because we continue writing back here.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Diatramentis Pigeon. Here is KWZ Brown number 2. Here is Geherban Vert Empire. Here is Sailor Choo Choo.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
This tone is a solid mid-tone that we had from the Clairfontaine. None of the lighters, not really much for the darkers. There's a couple of spots. There's a tiny bit of feathering that goes on, really not worth going into. There is a little bit of spread. Now, regardless of this feather and the spread that do occur, I think this could be used on this paper without any kind of major issue. It's just that you're losing the great shading that this ink had. Very serviceable here. Looking at the back of the page, you see that the ink does get deeper into the page. Nothing bled through touching to the page underneath, but I do not think you could write back here because of how deep it is. Lots of ghosting.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The medium flow Pilot E95S medium nib really showed the glory of this ink in both tone and shading. Now, I did wonder if this ink would lose its glory from a wet, broad nib. And it did. It darkened it, and it looked more like a red shading towards orange occasionally, really down to orange. And it was just not as nice on the page with much more red than orange. So for that, I think the medium flow medium or even a medium flow broad is the way to go to get this amazing tone and shading.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.